Hello friends, welcome to this episode where we discuss figures of speech. Now what we call figures of speech are essentially words which add a sense of beauty, effectivity and impressiveness to what we speak or write. Since literature almost always involves expressions which tend to move us by their beauty, by their love for the universal, a definite sense of balance and proportion, we find every worthwhile piece of literature, be the poetry, prose or drama, employing figures of speech. Now figures of speech are many, but some figures are more frequently used than others, and in this talk series, which I shall conveniently divide into two episodes, I would focus on around 14 or 15 figures of speech in all. In the first episode, I shall carry 10 figures of speech which is specified in the description below, and in the second episode we will focus on the remaining ones. So without any further delay, let us go to the first 10 prominent figures of speech. Well, comparison has been the hallmark of all good literature since time immemorial. To ensure that expressions are embellished through comparisons, writers have frequently used similes and metaphors as the two most frequently used comparison statements in their literature. Now, how do we define a simile? Well, a simile can be defined in several ways, but we can, for our understanding's sake, take a simile as a figure of speech which consists of an explicit statement of comparison between two dissimilar things. The root word here is explicit. As such, a simile will have words such as like, as, so, similarly, such, etc. And so, if we see such words as these in a sentence, we need to look out for comparison between two dissimilar things, which will form a simile. Some common examples of simile might include: the child shows the man as morning shows the day, or for example, the champak odors fall like sweet thoughts in a dream. Another example still: higher still and higher from the earth thou springest, like a cloud of fire. So this is all about a simile. We detect an explicit statement of comparison between two things which are usually dissimilar in kind. Now we move on to the second figure of speech, which is a metaphor, which incidentally also involves comparison, but here the comparison is not explicitly stated as in a simile, but it is only indirectly implied through suggestiveness. Let us go straight to the examples for our easier understanding. For example, in the oft quoted sentence, variety is the spice of life, or the Lord is my rock and my fortress, we have points of comparison between two things. In the first case, for example, variety is compared to spice. In other words, the writer wants us to understand that just as spice adds flavor to food, varieties of experiences often make our life interesting. So this is a metaphor because the comparison is not explicitly stated. Now the third important figure of speech is personification, which is rather easy. As the term implies, the figure is nothing but putting qualities or characteristics of living beings on abstract ideas or inanimate objects. For example, thirsty earth soaks up the rain. So obviously earth is something which is not quote unquote living in the traditional sense of the term, and when we ascribe thirst to the earth, we are personifying it, and therefore the sentence becomes a personification. Or for example, another sentence, this time from Shakespeare: nature might stand up and say to all the world, this was a man. So it's nature said to stand up like a human being and announce before the world that somebody was quote unquote a man. Okay. Here there is a personification of nature. Now the fourth figure of speech for today is what we know as an apostrophe. An apostrophe would consist of a short emotional address, usually mentally charged or emotionally charged address, meant for either an absent or a dead person, or even to an abstract idea somehow connected to the context. So that is an apostrophe. Well, some common examples of apostrophe would be, well, it's a quotation from a poem by Goldsmith: "O luxury! Exclamation mark, thou cursed be heaven's decree. How ill exchanged are things like these for thee." Or another sentence, this time from Byron: "Roll on, thou deep and dark blue ocean." So clearly, in both the cases, the addressee is inanimate, and hence it is an apostrophe. The fifth figure of speech is what we know as an antithesis. Well, an antithesis can be defined as a figure of speech in which two oppositely meaning ideas are put against one another for the sake of emphasis or to communicate greater importance. And very common examples of antithesis would be: united we stand, divided we fall. So clearly, the idea is one idea is put against another for greater rhetorical effect. Another example: he was not the master but the slave of his speech. The next figure of speech for today, which happens to be the sixth, is epigram. Now, how do we define an epigram? Well, an epigram can be defined as a figure of speech in which there is a surface or superficial contradiction in sense, which leads us to some deeper meaning underneath. For example, in the sentence, "I am content, I don't like my situation," we are apparently shocked at the contradiction, but thinking a bit deeply, we understand that the poet tells that though he is satisfied with his present condition, his situation invites him to work further and harder so that his present situation improves. Again in the sentence, "Our enemy is our helper," we are puzzled by the apparent contradiction until we realize that the speaker is drawing attention to the fact that our enemy, by exploring and exploiting our defects, are helping us by drawing our attention to our faults and work for their improvement. Right? Now we come to the next figure of speech, which happens to be the seventh, which is oxymoron. An oxymoron can be defined as a rhetorical device that uses two opposite or contradictory terms, one after the other, in order to project an effect. Oxymoron is usually defined as a phrase that combines two words that seem to be the opposite of each other. Now, the question that arises under such circumstances is, why are such contradictory or opposite words used in sentences? They are usually used to heighten the effect of sentences, as we shall now see in these examples. For example, in the sentence, "no light but rather darkness visible," which is from Milton, the depth and intensity of the darkness is highlighted through this contradiction. And again in the sentence, "he was regularly irregular in class," the student's constant irregularity of attendance is highlighted through juxtaposition of opposite meaning words. Alliteration, which is our next figure of speech, can be defined as a repetition of the same letter sound, vowel or consonant sounds at the beginning or about the middle or at the end of successive or nearly successive words. This figure of speech is largely auditory in scope and impact. Let us now take a very popular examples. We have this quotation from Coleridge: "The fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free." We cannot fail to detect the repetition of the F sounds in foam, flew, furrow, followed, free, and therefore we can easily say or detect that this is an alliteration. Let us take another example. "How high His Highness holds his haughty head." So, we can surely detect in this sentence the repetition of the H sound occurring in almost every word. Why almost? In every word. How high His Highness holds his haughty head. So, alliteration is essentially, as I have said, a figure of speech which is largely auditory in scope. That is, we can, once we read the sentence, detect auditorily that there is a repetition of similar sounding words or syllables in successive or nearly successive words. Right. Now, we go to the next figure of speech, which is onomatopoeia. Again, this is also an auditory figure of speech. Why? Because this figure consists in the use of words, the sound of which suggests the sense of the sentence or the idea. For example, the words buzzing of bees, the hissing of a snake, the twittering of swallows, they all reflect the auditory equivalent of the source of their sounds, like buzzing of bees, hissing of a snake. And therefore, such figures in sentences are usually meant to heighten the auditory effect of the lines. This is onomatopoeia. Well, the 10th and final figure of speech for today's episode is interrogation. Now, we may somehow or the other know what interrogation is, but as a figure of speech, interrogation has a very specialized term of use. What is it? Well, interrogation as a figure of speech consists in the use of words whose answers are indicated in the question itself. In other words, in such questions, no answer is expected by the speaker, since he knows that the listeners have the obvious answers for such questions. Right? So, essentially, an interrogation as a figure of speech is a question laden sentence whose answers are already known among the people who are exchanging this discourse. Like, for example, but why should we care about the opinion of the many? Well, in this question, the speaker obviously assumes that everybody will agree that we should not care about the opinion of the many. And again in the sentence, this time it is from a poem of Gray: "Can storied urn or animated bust back to its mansion call the fleeting breath?" Right? The obvious implied answer is no, since no one who is dead can be brought back to life. Right? So, these are the 10 figures of speech we have covered today. In the next episode, we shall deal with 4 more, including the all important metonymy and synecdoche. Till then, stay safe and goodbye.